interpreting the results from Sustain. Once you've created all the information on a particular project or version, you can move on to the results page. Now, when you move on to the results page, you will see a number of graphs and figures, etc. However, if you move on to the results page and you see a warning like this, this means that you haven't completed all the data that's required to generate results. So the tool will tell you which of the critical fields you haven't completed. And in this case here, I've got version 1 as an unidentified primary packaging volume. So I'm missing that piece of data. And also in version 1, I've defined use, but I haven't put hours per week in there. So I need to sort those out before I see my results. So I quickly go back into my project. So it was version 1, and it told me I was missing packaging volume. So I go to packaging. So here it's correct. So I've got a 0 in there. So if I put a figure in there, whatever my number is, so I've completed that particular field now. And it also told me that I was missing, and there we can see that I'd specified it uses energy, but I hadn't specified number of hours per week. So we put a figure in there. Now I should be able to go on to my results, and I should see some generated figures and graphs. So this is what you will see when you come to the results page. Now, Sustain presents the results in 3 main ways. The results for the product only, which is what I'm looking at here. The results for the packaging only, if you've defined packaging. So I can flick to packaging. So those are slightly different, and we'll discuss them in a moment. And we also have a combined score, which again adds the 2 scores together, but we'll discuss that in a moment. We'll just go through each stage. So for the product, you get 6 parameters that are measured here. You see them in the top part of the table. So each of these parameters is a 1 to 20 scale, and it takes into account a number of issues, and there is an algorithm behind each one. So for example, supply chain logistics looks at where you manufacture the product and where the materials for that product are being brought from to the manufacturing point, and also the mode of transport. So if you're transporting your materials a long way by a polluting mode of transport such as air, you would have a high score. If you're sourcing them locally and transporting them by road, you would have a much lower score. Materials and processes again looks at the types of materials you have in your product, the carbon content of those materials, etc., etc. So a number of issues, and that gives you a score between 1 and 20. End of life considers how many different types of materials are in the product, whether they are easy to take apart and separate, and what you specify in terms of the end of life route for each of those materials. So if you've got a very simple product that has a limited number of materials that's easy to take apart, and you send everything to be recycled, that would be a good score. And if you have a very complicated product with lots of different types of materials permanently bonded together, which makes recycling difficult, and they have to go to landfill, etc., that would be a bad score. Delivery logistics again looks at where the product is made, where the product is sold, and how you move that product around. Also, it looks at how many you can fit into a vehicle or a container, so the efficiency of shipping. Recycled content is based on the percentage of the total weight of the product that contains a recycled material. And design looks at a number of issues such as types of materials, again, carbon footprint of materials, etc. So those are the 6 parameters. These are all explained in the user guide. And as I said, they score on a 1 to 20 basis, or a 0 to 20 basis. The principle of this diagram here shows you the total area covered by those scores. The idea with Sustain is the smaller the area, the more sustainable the product. So a good score is 0 or 1. and a bad score is 20. So you're looking to take the score as low as possible. What the tool does, it takes each of these 6 scores out of 20 and simply adds them up to give you an overall version score. So you can see here version 1 score is 42.78, and that will be out of 120, I guess, but we just look at the single score. And version 2 scores 26.69. So version 2 would be considered to be more sustainable than version 1. If you have 6 versions on here and all these are filled, this graph could become a little bit complex, difficult to see. So you can turn each version on and off if you just want to look at them separately. Now for these are what you would call your qualitative results, the scores, and then further down in the table we have a whole range of quantitative results. So you see things like the weight of your product. So again, version 2 is a lighter product. The volume of your product. Now in this one, version 2 is a bigger product. Total carbon embedded in each product. Again, version 2 is a much smaller carbon footprint. Carbon from transport, which is all the logistics, the supply of materials, the delivery to end user, and carbon from product use. In this case, they both use exactly the same amount of electricity and therefore have the same carbon score. There's also a water footprint figure. Now, this is purely the water embodied in the materials used in the product. So some materials have what's called quite a high water footprint. So it takes a lot of water to create them, to refine them, to process them. So this is purely the materials. Water footprint isn't measured for anything else. None of the processes or transports have that. Then we look at the disposal of the products and some very simple but useful parameters. The amount of material recycled in terms of percentage by weight at the end of life, the amount landfilled and the amount incinerated, and then the total carbon footprint from those processes. So as you can see, version 2 is 100% recycled and has a much lower carbon footprint than version 1, which is partly recycled, partly landfilled. And then this is a piece of information you've put in as a user. So this is your specified expected product life in weeks, and this gives you a total life cycle carbon. So this is all of the material carbon, all of the transport carbon, and the carbon from product use. But the product use figure is obviously altered to reflect the life expectancy. So 3.028 per year, but over a life expectancy of 48 weeks, it will be slightly lower. So there are your results in terms of the table. And then a little further down, we have some very basic design advice. So what this just looks at, it looks at 3 issues: recyclability, recycled content, and carbon footprint, and tries to highlight where your particular version is performing well and where it's performing not so great. So recyclability, the tool looks at the number of materials you have, and it says here the product contains 4 materials. You've indicated that the product is easy to disassemble. Could you reduce the mix of materials? So some basic advice is to try and make it more recyclable. Recycled content, overall version 1 contains 50% recycled material by weight. Most of that comes from component 4, but it highlights here components 1 and 2 only have a low recycled content. So again, could anything be done about that? Higher recycled content, slightly more sustainable, and possibly more circular, helps contribute to the circular economy. And then finally, carbon footprint, it explains your total carbon footprint per use and looks at how that is split down. And by far the biggest in this one is the impact from materials. So again, can you do anything to reduce that? Same for version 2, you'll see some different results. This one in particular, the biggest impact is actually from use in terms of carbon. And again, all of the components have some recycled content. So they all score fairly well, and the overall is 71.74%. So that's some basic advice. You can then export any of these results out. You can print it to a PDF file. So if you click this button, it will ask you for a file name and it will create a PDF file of these results. Or you can export to Excel. So if you click this button here, it will ask you to input a file name, and it will save all of your results to an Excel export. And then once you have it in that Excel sheet, you can manipulate it more, you can draw more graphs, you can analyze the data. That Excel sheet also contains all the inputs as well. So obviously you may want to share this information with somebody who doesn't have access to Sustain. Exporting it to the Excel sheet shows the results, but it also shows the inputs. It explains what materials are in your product, where it's made, where the materials are coming from, recycled content, etc. So that communicates all the information to whichever stakeholders need to see this sort of thing. So that's how the results page looks. As I say, we've got results for product only. We've also got results for packaging only. Packaging only looks at 5 different metrics, again on a 0 to 20 score. Some are, well, they're similar to the product, as you see, recycled content, recyclability, materials and processes, etc. So these exist here again in the same way. You can turn the different versions on and off to allow you to see them. If you've got more than, say, 2 or 3, it might be a little bit complicated. Again, a whole table of different types of results, looking at weights and volumes feature more in the packaging results, because obviously the size and the weight of packaging can be quite important. We still look at carbon footprint and water footprint, and again, disposal. Similar type of design advice, again at the end, recyclability, recycled content and carbon footprint, and again the ability to export these to PDF or Excel. And then finally we have what's known as a combined score. So this simply takes the overall version scores. So if we see here, my version scores were 42 and 26 for product, 26 and 40 for packaging, and it adds these two together. So the total combined score, it's not weighted in any way. It is purely a simple addition of the two figures. And as we can see, again, version 2 comes out slightly better because it's got a slightly lower score. So again, there's a note here that says, that explains how we look at this, and we would always recommend looking at the product and packaging results separately, because these just give a lot more detail and a lot more insight into where the results actually come from, how they were generated. So that's how to interpret the results in the Sustain tool.